Hey John, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Patrick?
Good. I'm
It's
glad to talk with you again.
same here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
No, of
Pleasure.
course. It's always great to talk. So, how are things going in Florida? You're back in school after the hurricane?
Yeah, this school got really walloped because we're on the Gulf Coast in Clearwater. I live in Orlando, which is middle of the state, so we didn't get it as bad. But the beach is still closed. School only opens early this week, what I've been doing is chasing after students to make sure they can get stuff done if they have somewhere to work. And a lot of them didn't have power for a week, so quite a bit of work to try to catch up. But that's okay. They want to
Yeah.
learn and they're motivated, so that's all I need. So
Well, good. I'm glad things are getting back to normal. So, we're going to cover Argentina and Brazil today. I think that's going to give us plenty to talk about. So, which one do you want to take on first? The positive story or the good news or the bad news first?
let's do Argentina.
Yeah,
Because
good news first.
Argentina,
Better news.
yeah, it's better news because things are improving and they sort of went along the ways when we talked before that I thought it was going to do. Was a couple things in between that were a little bit, I don't know, hard to explain. Really, the spread between the blue rate and the official rate, it's widened out again after it had collapsed. And it's kind of back to normal again. But the official rate is still a crawling peg. It's still controlled.
Mm.
And there's still questions of whether they're going to dollarize or not. They can still dollarize. And actually, just looking again, what I try to do, and Argentines have done this forever, this back when we used to do convertibility kind of stuff, take the ratio of the monetary base to foreign exchange reserves. And gross is fine. The IMF just renewed a loan to Argentina. So they're still in the good graces of the IMF, which is fine. So looking at net reserves is really not useful at this point. Only when they're on the bad side of the multilaterals, then the net reserves becomes a big problem. So, and you have a ratio of the monetary base to foreign exchange reserves almost right about the official rate, a little bit below it. Let me just look quickly at this. I was looking at M2. M2 is right at the black market rate, 1200. That would be the
Okay.
exchange rate that fully backs the banking system. And then the monetary base is quite a bit lower than that. So yeah, it's below the official rate. When we talked last time, that ratio was somewhere around 300. So if they want to dollarize, they can do so if they
That's
decide to
still
do it. I don't understand exactly the hesitation at this point. Maybe it could be the IMF saying, maybe not do it. Although they ended up backing Cavallo as well years ago, despite the fact that they had also reservations about doing that. So
Is there still
it's
political pushback? Because I've had Argentinians on they say, but we want to have the autonomy to have our own currency still. So still just a political hesitancy to dollarize.
Yeah, there's always that, right? There's
Yeah.
seniors involved as well. Okay, the ratio to the official rate is 756. And the monetary base to foreign exchange reserves is 756. And the official rate's at 1,000, 1,100.
Okay.
And the parallel rate's at 1286. So they could do it if they
They
wanted
could
to.
do it
But
basically at the blue rate right now if they wanted to.
that's right. They could do it at the blue rate. They could do it at the official rate. They're both back, at least the monetary base.
What do you think explains the divergence between the black market rate, the blue rate, and the official rate still? Because when you sent me a piece, I guess, in May, and you had a great chart that clicked for me when I saw it, where obviously once they liberalize, it's going to converge, right? Because of the
Right.
supply and demand. But why is there still this big divergence now that it's been liberalized for 9, 10 months?
Well, you have a lot of monetary looseness packed in from the prior regimes. We still have, monetary base growing 210% year on year. So
Mm.
this hasn't completely translated into prices, although inflation has come down to below 4% on an annualized basis. But year over year, it's still high.
Yep.
So there's still an adjustment to do in the nominal rate. That was when we talked before, that was stagnant to that date, right? That didn't mean that the underlying equilibrium rate wouldn't move, and that's probably what's happened a little bit. But I think also there's been quite a bit of speculation about what's going to happen next. Milei was, as I thought he was going to be able to manage to get most of his stuff through Congress, and he did because the president in Argentina has massive amounts of executive power.
Mm.
And that was put in by the Kirchners. So that's one of those things, everybody pushes for something and it comes right back to bite you. So that's exactly what happened here. So, and the fiscal side is much better. They haven't reported the August numbers yet, but they're turning in primary surpluses. They're turning in nominal surpluses. And then, we see Milei going forward with these with privatizations. And
Yep.
now he's decided to get rid of the fiscal authority, that's like my dream. At least for the IRS. The IRS is, and we go to like public choice stuff with James Buchanan, Peter Bettke. Those have always looked at how the public sector works from an incentive point of view and toward intellect, and they show pretty reasonably. Even if you are a cost cutter, the size of the public sector will tend to grow. Even if you're not explicitly corrupt, there's implicit corruption going on at the tax authority in Argentina. The salaries that they're being paid are extraordinary, the benefits, et cetera, and they really don't just because they can tax people. And then of course there's opportunities for corruption massively. And also with trade restrictions, same thing, right? So
take one look at Argentina's economy and the state of things, and it's obvious there's corruption going on, right? I mean, how could there not be?
Well, everywhere. I mean, I'm from Chicago. I lived in New Jersey and worked in New York. We are not strangers to corruption. So, but Argentina hasn't quite got there yet. Brazil did, and for a while at least, they put corrupt officials in jail. That was the difference. In the United States, I'm from Illinois. There was a governor there who went to jail, and two governors that went to jail, Ryan and Bukevich. And we used to say things like, Illinois, we had to change the license plate where our governors make the license plates, So in the United States, people in jail make license plates.
Yeah.
So,
but he's not.
That's the difference. There's corruption in the United States.
So with the tax authority, though, he's basically firing everyone and then rehiring or restructuring, right? Like there's still going to be a tax authority, right?
There's a lot of stuff you can do online. So instead of paying, and that's the same thing. We hired 80,000 IRS people here. Why? Why not just make it easier
to go after $600 purchases, right? That's
exactly. Old ladies. It's silly as. And now what that does is it increases their power.
It's like a cash burn startup, right? You spend $100,000 on this person, but what's he going to recoup in taxes a year? 50,000. So it's a net loss of 50,000, maybe 50,000.
Their auditors, their auditors are paid ridiculous amounts to get nothing back. Yeah,
you can't fire it. Well, Millet did, but government officials.
Well, no one thought that would ever happen, right?
That's funny. The protest videos at Argentina crack me up too. I don't know why, but Argentinian they dance. I guess at their protests. I don't know why they've got the people at the tax authority dancing because they're protesting. I don't know. It's a funny visual, but
they're having a good time. I guess I don't know.
I guess severance must not be that bad.
And Argentina has mostly their taxing is not good. Okay, but other countries like Brazil, the tax system is worse. The problem there is that price controls, et cetera, that are implicit taxes. Pretty much gotten rid of those. And at first, we had this huge what we call a correctional inflation when you start to lift price controls and things like that, but the inflation rates come down massively.
Walk me through that then, because you texted me in April or May, like the first month where it dropped to double digits or below 10. You said it's going to drop below 10. I said, wow, okay, no one's saying that. And it has. And now for the past few months, it's kind of stabilized at 4% monthly. So you can just walk listeners through,
it's still it's a little below. September came in at 3.47% annualized. Okay. Year on year, it's come down a lot, but it's still 209%. So it's still, because that's a base problem, right? So the reason is if you completely stop printing money, it's going to bring inflation down.
Yeah.
The problem is at the beginning, when you have price controls in place and they're binding, which they were in Argentina, if you start lifting them, you're going to have this corrective inflation. So you get this big surge. Joaquin Levy in Brazil, when he was Minister of Finance there, he did the same thing. He took the bullet and got rid of all the price controls because Petrobras and all these state enterprises were bleeding. And the same thing in Argentina. Argentina just desperately needs investment in sectors that are controlled by the public sector, including electricity generation and distribution, the railroads, despite the fact that you had a lot of renationalization after the problems of 2001, 2005. So I think they're going to go back to selling assets that really don't work very well under the control of the public sector. And that will also help the government because and it looks like they're going to try to do this, any revenues that they get from privatization, they can use to pay down debt because that's an asset, pay down debt. When you sell your asset, you pay your down debt. The problem is when it's used for current expenditure. And we saw that a lot during the big privatization pushes of the 1990s and the 2000s. Not so much in Argentina. Argentina was pretty good. They just renationalized everything and invaded the private pension system. Brazil, we saw that too. We saw that, they were using these revenues that were one-offs for current expenditure. And that delayed the fiscal adjustment that they needed to have. So and you also had they liberalized the exchange rate to a certain extent. So that had an inflationary shock. It's not really inflation, but it's just you have a price level jump. Yep. And then the question is, what happens after that? If the monetary authority doesn't accommodate it, then your inflation is going to come down quite quickly. And that's clearly what's happening here.
When you say the monetary authority accommodated, What do you mean by accommodate?
Putting money at the same pace.
If they just let it happen, basically.
They let it happen and not put money into the system. The policy rate is still 40%, which is still pretty high for 3.75% inflation. But if we look at the monetary base growth on a monthly basis, it's something around, it was negative. It's already negative in October, but the growth rates came down dramatically early on to below 100% year on year. Actually, way below in about 58, 48, about 50% last year, the monetary base. Central bank already started tightening. And they've accelerated again. But you also get, when inflation comes down, an increase in money demand, a good one. People want to hold money now, right?
Does that explain some of the dollars starting to come back into Argentina?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So also companies need working capital. The financial system has to regroup after these changes to lend for working capital, and families need work. Some of them have a lot of holdings abroad or just even across the real plate, so that's when you start seeing dollars come back. So the increase in monetary base will bring this inflow, and they've not monetized the whole inflow. So they're still leaning against the wind.
Does that exacerbate inflation, all the dollars coming back in?
No, because that's a reflection of increases in money demand, in real money demand. So people are willing to hold more money, they're going to spend it.
Okay. So it's economic activity. So it's
exactly
they're coming to buy good. Okay. So the liberalizing of the price controls, then the removal of the price controls, does that explain that's the cost of living spike that people are feeling right now? It's high inflation. So how long can that go on then? When does Argentina start to feel more normal? Because I see people all the time talking about how expensive it feels right now to be in Argentina. Even the foreigners with dollars are saying, okay, my steak isn't cheap here anymore.
Yeah, well, that's part of the adjustment process, right? Because that puts an immediate damper on spending. And it also promotes, if people are confident that inflation is going to stay low, then they'll bring their money back in from dollars and convert it into pesos. So how long does that take? Well, I went back when we talked last time. I went back and looked at the convertibility plan. This is exactly the same dynamic that's going on. And, output got slammed, partially because of interest rates going up, but also because of the inflation spike. Inflation is not expansionary. It doesn't help growth. On the contrary, in all the countries I've ever dealt with, you could predict a recession if you had an inflation spike. Why? Because purchasing power goes down and companies can't plan as well, and so investment suffers, and it's not just in the long term, it's in the short term in some of these countries. Short term, the long term happens very quickly in Argentina especially. So as long as they feel that this is going to stick around and things are more expensive, then they'll start bringing back money. What you've had is also you had a continuation of inflation in non-tradables, so in services and things like that, whereas tradables, which are determined by the exchange rate and the external market, stopped. This will put a little bit of, it's a recessionary type of, a disinflationary type of environment that puts downward pressure on services. So you're saying people with their wages that can't buy as much stuff. Well, yeah, that's part of the process. At some point, we get to a point where the benefits of doing this get better. Credit comes back because banks are willing to take longer bets. Working capital is still expensive, but they come back. And I think it was interesting because we're seeing a repeat in a lot of ways of the convertibility plan. The IMF, after convertibility was put in place, predicted Argentina was going to have a massive recession, and they didn't. Typically what happens in this environment, especially if they dollarize, you'll have a consumption boom. It takes a little bit of time. You have to get through the first, the first adjustment with the prices, but you get a consumption boom because people are willing to now consume. They're not worried about prices going up in the future. So, and that's, Guillermo Calvo, the famous Argentine economist, who is really a lovely man and a fantastic economist, has done extensive stuff on this. And that's what you get when you fix the exchange rate. And people think that even if it's less credible, then you even get a bigger boom. So people think this is going to go away next year, then we're going to start consuming now. But at some point, you're going to get a reasonable, every single one of these exchange rate or stabilization attempts led to a consumption boom. The real, a lot of people predicted a recession in 1994. No, Brazil had a consumption boom.
Consumption? So what kind of consumption? Are we talking they go out and buy cars and washing machines? Is it service consumption? Do the restaurants boom? What kind of consumption?
Yeah, it's sort of basal, right? So the first things are basic consumption goods. Then it moves to, like you said, restaurants and things like that, and it moves into durables at some point. Why? Because banks are starting to start lending again. People are comfortable buying a car. They don't have to worry about putting food on the table from 1 month to the next. So as nominal interest rates come down, the opportunity cost of consumption goes down. And we've seen quite a bit of that. In fact, I think the central bank I was just looking at some of the monetary data. They're having trouble keeping the rate as high as it is a little bit, despite the fact that monetary base is growing. Because if you look at the call rates, they're kind of pushing down. But I think we're sort of at this this part when I don't like using airplane landing analogies, especially soft landings, things like that.
Overdone these days, right?
Especially when, and I don't see any landing in sight for the United States. But I think sort of in that holding pattern,
Okay.
waiting to see. And people are like, okay, we've gone this far. Is it going to continue? Now, I did see, you have students protesting. I don't know, maybe you have a better feel, but I don't feel anything like any of these political disruptions are threatening Milei's advance. And he does use chaos, like some other leaders we know, to get stuff done. And he's doing that. We had one unfortunate event yesterday, I think, as Diana Mondino left. She was the...
Saw the headline. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, no, she voted to lift the embargo on Cuba. And that apparently I don't know if I doubted she would do that without Milei's blessing, but that created a big furor in Argentina. Yeah, sort of strange.
Argentina, I was going to say, it's so strange politically to me. It doesn't always make sense. Like I mentioned, dancing is a joke, but like they're going through this huge fiscal adjustment after, 20 years of economic devastation. Cuba is the issue. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, she was doing fantastic. She's great. There's a deeper story that I don't quite understand there. So it probably...
Cuba's active still politically. Yeah. They mess around.
I had this discussion with a student yesterday. Why do we still have an embargo on Cuba? I don't think it helps things.
I think I would suspect, and I don't know anything, I would suspect that behind the scenes, they're probably still fairly bad actors.
Well, they are.
Yeah.
They're definitely bad actors.
I think they're still doing bad things in South America. I have to imagine they're involved in something. People, I agree.
I think there's other layers to go. Yeah. So anyway, this is a far afield. But Argentina also, as you said, it's complicated because the Peronism is not monolithic. It's very fractured. Just like our two parties here. And,
I saw, there were clashes between Peronist factions at protests. I've seen. Yeah,
that's not new. That is not new. It's been very fractious, and only a couple leaders have been able to get Peronists together. First was Perón, but Menem was very good at getting the more liberal, in the classical economic sense, parts of the Peronists with the more protectionist. He was able to do that. For some reason, and he was quite radically left. He led the convertibility plan. He led privatization program. He went through about 5 economics ministers before he finally settled on Cavallo. I was there for the unfortunate July 1989. I arrived there to do some research. And the day that Puig, the minister of economy, Puig, had a heart attack and passed away, inflation was running at 75% a week, which if you compound that is 53 million % a year. It was great for me, as an economist. Wow, I get to see hyperinflation up close. But, Menem just kept, and he was the chief economist for Born, which is also kind of odd, right? So, and he kept going with conservative ministers of finance or minister of the economy. And that was, Menem was a very multifaceted guy. And I think he reflected the Peronist Party, as we've seen. I'm not a political scientist, but I have to keep an eye on this stuff. So scientists, but it's certainly not unified. And there are parts of the party that are actually quietly supporting Milei, which is not. So, and that's the only way you can get anything done, really. But I haven't seen, the ley omnibus done, more or less, right? And again, how did they get it done? They took the stuff out that they could do by executive order, and then left this stuff in. And most of the really important stuff was executive orders. So, and they have this really strange system that the only way an executive order can be overturned is that both houses overturn it. Getting that kind of vote is really difficult. So that part I was expecting. You brought up the right questions in Argentina. When do we get recovery? That's not that easy. Certainly, the IMF comes out with forecasts that are usually old when they do, because they have to go through a full political process. But we've seen private sector ones not quite so good as well, especially in the United States. But that's a good question. The dynamic is to have a consumption boom as long as they keep to the straight and narrow and improving the fiscal side. The fiscal side was in such bad shape that it's going to take years to straighten that thing out. The question is when do the Argentines become tired of this thing?
That's everyone's question, right? And then I think probably middle of next year, they're going to start looking at the congressional elections, right? And it's going to start being about, they're going to be voting on Milei's record. And we're going to know if it gets cut off after 2 years or if he gets another.
That's a hard question. Yeah.
Because the politics don't make any sense. I have no idea what's going to happen with the congressional elections there.
No, it's exactly, and how important they are, and the same as in a lot of other countries. You say, how much does this impose on the executive? Well, certainly the executive in Argentina is very strong relative to other countries, right? So, but looking at the index, indicator of economic activity, and they're mostly negative numbers. There's some base effects still, and you've had some positive numbers year on year, but it's still not telling us definitively that we're in a recovery.
They're taking pains. They're still taking some pain.
Yeah, exactly.
So back to to the potential consumption boom then, because there's one asset I'm curious about because, you get hyperinflation in situations like Argentina. Real estate tends to have a monetary premium embedded, but if you get a consumption boom and credit starts coming back, does that imply that, real estate has maybe bottomed in Argentina, or could it still drain as money comes out of real estate because, they can trust the currency a little more and they don't need to hold real estate as a store of value?
Well, I think it's not only the currency, it's whether you can get your money out or not. And that's the really biggest question. And I think they're getting close to having that completely liberal and sort of liberalizing in stages. So like you're an investor, when you go in, you don't think about just going in, you think about how you're going to get out.
Well, in a country like Argentina, I like there's certain, if you buy your family's house in Miami and that's where you're going to live for 20 years, okay, you don't need to worry about that. You buy the house. But if you're buying an investment property like many Argentinians do, they buy a house because it's going to hold its value against the currency. But if they can get the money out, maybe a lot of them go, okay, well, I'd rather take this house, sell it, and put the money in, I don't know, U.S. stocks.
Yeah, I think that's coming to an end too. I mean, it lags these other things somewhat, but that is usually part of the consumption boom is real estate.
Yeah, as credit comes back. So it could, I could see it both ways. I just don't know. I guess the question is how much of the monetary premium drains out of real estate versus how much increased demand do you get for real estate as credit starts to come back and money flows back in?
That is a central question, especially if you want to buy real estate. It's probably a good idea. The first thing I did was call my friend back in December, an Argentine economist there, and I said, these things are cheap. And he said, you got to wait till you can see if you can get your money back out again. So I said, you're right.
Yeah. Well, Milei did make some reforms to rental laws, if I understood that correctly. So apparently as an investment, if you're going to rent it out or run an Airbnb, it's become more attractive, I guess, but you still can't necessarily get the money out.
Yes. Well, it is still restricted. The plan apparently is to go to full convertibility, which again helps the inflow of dollars, right? Because an inward restriction is an outward restriction, and an outward restriction is an inward restriction, because people aren't going to go in if they're not fairly confident when they want to leave, they can leave. So I think there's credibility questions still on this thing. Once they start changing these, how soon might they, change their minds, and certainly
I want to be optimistic.
Has history.
I want to be as optimistic as I can about Argentina, but it was, 20 years of total economic chaos, and I'm not inclined to call a trend change after 10 months just yet.
Yeah, I think Argentina's is a tough one, as most countries in Latin America are. But, I think you had people just fed up with the economic situation. I remember you thinking that my opinion was outrageously optimistic, and I really wasn't that optimistic because there's all these other things. But these other things impinge later in the process. The question is, what can the government do and what's going to be the effects? The question among the economists, I was talking, well, can Argentina dollarize? And it was always, anyone that went through the convertibility plan knows that all you got to do is pick the right exchange rate and they can dollarize. And, they got to acquire more reserves and stuff like that. No, you don't. You just have to pick the right exchange rate. So then the question is, how long will it last? And the only way you make this last is having fiscal adjustment and liberalizing things. And that's the hard part, because that's a real shock to the system.
Yeah. I think one of the stories that kind of got overlooked too, that I thought was interesting, and I don't fully understand why, but he shipped their gold reserves to London. So I don't know if that was an IMF thing or if they had just been looted before because I remember one time when Kirchner lost, I remember, armored cars leaving burning buildings to her province was a headline.
Well, that is, the Kirchners tried to invade the central bank.
Like that happened, right? Like they tried to steal the gold, literally.
Yes, they tried. Well, the foreign exchange reserve.
Yeah. So
they tried to, do a la Chavez invaded the central bank of Venezuela, and they tried to do it as well. And it's explicitly against the law.
Yeah.
So a certain central bank
kind of worked too, right? Venezuela. The Venezuelan gold that is theoretically the people's is still stuck in London, right? Like Maduro hasn't been able to get his hands on it.
Yeah.
So I guess
it's
pragmatic, thinking if he doesn't get another term or in 20 years, someone might want to loot it again. So why not send it there and hopefully it's safe?
Yeah. They have this weird idea that they think they can just go to the central bank and take the money out. But as you know, and everybody who's ever looked at a central bank balance sheet, you have to work through the balance sheet. It's the only possible way you can do it. Yeah. So the government would have to do is give an obligation to the central bank. So it would be effectively borrowing the gold. Outright confiscation is very difficult to do. Yeah. So, the central bank president at the time lost his job because he went against, really showed some real internal fortitude. And he said, and he was probably worried about going to jail too, because he would have violated the law if he'd done it.
Yeah.
So, but that part of the institutional framework that came from convertibility and the independence of the central bank, not for completely all the time, but the Central Bank of Argentina still has a little bit of independence and is getting more independence as we move along. So that's my speculation. I didn't see that article, but I know that the Kirchner side of the
that's the first thing I thought about was the headline of them Kirchner's trying to rob the central bank. Maybe he's just getting it out of the country because who knows. But before we move to Brazil, man, I guess what note or what grade would you give Milei on his first 10 months or 11 months?
I give him a 9.
9 out of 10? Pretty good, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's, especially against the expectation that people had. So
my
expectations,
were wild,
right? My expectations were kind of like this. I've been dealing with Argentina a long time. It's complicated. I don't know every ins and outs, but I know quite a bit about it. And I experienced a lot of stuff when I was there. It seemed like every time I went there, I got to see an event, So, and trying to understand it is not easy. Like all countries, politics is not easy. But I had some good people working with me that really explained quite a bit of what was going on. They predicted that the consensus around convertibility would fall apart. And it's mainly within the Peronist party, right?
Yeah.
Although the protagonists were the radicals. Actually, the fallout came within the Peronist party. And so you have all these factors. You have the traditional unionists, you have businesses are part of it too. So, and then you have governors of the provinces, which always have different interests than not always the same interests as the federal government, unless they're being completely subsidized, like the province of Buenos Aires, which that has been cut down as well. So, to expect utopia, expecting way too much, and to grade him bad.
No, but I feel like it's been refreshing too, because it feels like he stayed pretty true to his word. Seems like he's been fairly consistent on what he campaigned on is what he's been trying to do for the most part.
Yeah, it's an interesting watch it evolve. Pricing in the market move all over the place. But if you had gone into Argentine equities, you had done extremely well.
There was some. Everyone was just buying Argentina to buy Argentina on the news, and now I think
the bonds, unbelievably, So but we're still discounting a very high probability of default over the next 5 years, but nothing like it was close to 100%, and especially when they were in default. I mean after the last restructuring. So it's interesting, and it's sometimes you need a Tasmanian devil. If you have too many things that are entrenched, the problem is that being the Tasmanian devil, you can sometimes run into a wall. It kind of hurts you.
But I think eventually, if the game becomes too unfair to too many groups, people flip the game board over, and it feels like they, not playing anymore, and it seems like what happened. All right, let's do Brazil. Another crazy.
Yeah,
country.
I'm still where I was the last time we spoke.
I know you were pessimistic. You said of 3 times you've ever been truly bearish on Brazil in your career. The beginning of 2024 was one of them. So where are we now?
Or at the end of 2023, we're sort of going along what I thought. I mean, the fiscal rule is not a rule. If trying to come up with some way to cut spending, finally, they thought, you can't increase spending and then chase after it with more taxes. That's a dog chasing its tail. It's somebody running after a train that's left the station. You'll never catch up. And certainly Brazilians' tolerance for more taxes is about 0. So
no, you can't. They have the highest tax burden. They can't tax it anymore. There's no room for it.
And we're starting to see the reimplementation of what were called pedaladas. They were there. It's been showing up in the data for at least a year now. So directed credit has now growth has become a big part of.
Can you explain pedaladas to anyone?
Pedaladas, the ones that were used before under Dilma's administration, was what she would do is she would capitalize the state banks. And they would finance what would usually be part of the budget. And then when, of course, those didn't perform, they started to decapitalize, they'd stick more government debt in there. And when this created a really big credibility problems with the net debt figures. So, the central government has an asset, so that's out after, because they have a claim on the BNDES, they're not issuing to the market. So this was done without increasing the internal debt. It did increase gross debt, and that's why people started looking. Gross debt is a problem because they have so many foreign exchange reserves, right? So foreign exchange reserves come in, they sterilize them because, like you said, on the other in Argentina, it could be inflationary if they don't sterilize the.
How do they sterilize them? They put them in
issuing
treasuries?
bonds.
They issue the bond.
Yeah. So that's why it was better to have a net. It's not correct to really count the sterilization issuance as debt. Now, there's a cost of carry, which you earn less money on U.S. Treasuries than you do paying on government bonds in Brazil. So there's a cost to it.
The money comes in, they put it in U.S. Treasuries at whatever, 4%, and then they're issuing debt at Selic right now, which is 10.5%.
That was part of a project, to try to find out, what would Brazil could do with that cost of carry. And we had some discussion. I had they used a simple measure of the cost of carry, which ended up being more or less right. But the thing is, you have to bring the exchange rate in. And we have a situation right now in Brazil, which is actually very good, that may go away. And that is the foreign exchange reserves are bigger than the totality of the foreign debt.
Yeah. So they're over what, 300 billion more or less in foreign exchange reserves, correct?
Yep.
And then the foreign debt is
about 320 billion.
And corporates number. I mean, I remember 2016, the Dilma time, corporates were much more levered to the U.S. dollar too. I mean, that carry trade crushed many of a Brazilian company's balance sheets, and you still see some of it, but not nearly as much.
Yeah. So, but the important part of this also for the government is that when you got a devaluation of the real, an increase in the dollar, the public sector gained from it, which was the story in Venezuela for many years. It used to be that in Brazil, people thought, the exchange rate would get weak, and it would really put this huge fiscal pressure because they would owe more dollars abroad than they had in their own assets. Now, I think that explains some of the sort of recent dynamics of the real, which is different than it's ever been. We had a very expensive dollar with an improvement in the terms of trade.
Yeah. So now it
usually happen.
A cheaper real is more exports for Brazil, right? Is that?
Yep.
General concept.
And it also means the government is in better shape because their net debt falls. They have a capital gain on their foreign exchange reserves over and above the capital loss.
The treasuries are now worth more in local currency terms.
Right. And the private sector, too.
Yep.
Because, the current foreign exchange reserves are about double the size of the government's debt.
So does that mean domestic assets get cheaper? Because I'm trying to understand the real, too, because it looks like it's ready to blow. It looks like it's about ready to break above 6 to me. And I don't really see a fundamental case. Grain prices are down, and there's not really a bull case for grains. So exports, I don't see why it would go back to 4, or I have a harder time making that case.
Yeah, it's part of this is expectations of the new central bank president.
Yeah, that
right?
Too.
We're going to lose Roberto Campos Neto. And we did speak about this last time. The question is, will he hold the line, or is he being a chameleon just to get help get the markets on his side?
Who? The new guy.
The new guy, you mean? Yeah. And so far, he's shown himself to be fairly reasonable, although some of his recent statements of him being beholden kind of to Lula have been so great. And his best big buddy is Dr. Beluso.
What does that imply?
Means very loose monetary policy is what it implies.
Right.
And so
I think
the
question is what happens once he's actually in there and Lula starts cranking up the pressure and there's news articles every day about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that is a big question.
Does that explain the rate hikes? Because the only way I really understood the recent hike is that Campos Neto is just trying to hike the prices by 2% before he gets out of there because he knows what's coming with the other guy. And he's like, I'm just going to at least get it up there because I know it's coming back down no matter what.
Yeah. And I think Galípolo understands that. Yeah. I think he understands that. It gives him especially since he voted for it.
Yeah. So he can say, no, let's wait and see. Then suddenly you're into Q2 of 2025 and you can cut by 25 basis points. And all of a sudden you're at the end of 2025 and you're back to where you were 4 months ago.
Yeah, but it also gives him a credibility boost. It makes the market less nervous about him. Although we've seen, the precedent is on the fiscal side. The fiscal side is not good.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter what they do if they keep spending the way they're spending, right? The central bank can't fix the deficit.
Yeah, and taxes aren't going to fix it either.
So what can they cut then? I mean, what can they cut? So Haddad has been promising the market a plan of spending cuts, and it was supposed to come, and then it was supposed to come right after the elections were over last week, and now it's still not ready, and he's talking to Lula, and I expected by the time we spoke today, something would be out, and I was going to ask you about specifics.
There was a big rebellion. There was a big rebellion.
It's big news, right? Like it's the biggest political news in Brazil right now is this deficit cut or potential. So what was the rebellion? I don't know about that.
They don't want to cut their spending. Within ministries and a couple of the governors and, mostly in the coalition government, what's left to the Lula administration. And you might be cynical. You got some kamikaze guys there too. I don't know. These guys work in their own interest more than anything else. Yeah. So this is what happens. You can't just be a little pregnant.
Yeah.
And the prior fiscal rule was very good. And, the government took a waiver on it during COVID, which makes sense. It's an emergency. But then they went right back to the rule and started generating. They had a 4 percentage point swing in GDP, even higher to the upside.
They were running a surplus, right?
Surplus of 2.5% of GDP. And now we're back at minus 2.5. So there's almost a 5 percentage point swing in the primary deficit, which is...
And the deficit, it's going to get worse, right? There's projections for it to be potentially, I don't know, I think 4 is the number I think I saw, or it could be significantly worse next year.
Well, that's why people think inflation's probably going to go up as well, because either you get the central bank that fights it, what's going on the fiscal side, because I get inflationary pressure and they raise interest rates and that causes a recession. You get a recession, or you're going to have higher inflation. It's really not too, they're not the United States. They can't issue their own reserve currency. Although something like this is going to probably happen in the United States if we continue with what we're doing much longer. But Brazil, because it has a history of doing this, people get worried. And you saw inflation expectations came up. You had some commodity price inflation, which to me, that's not that important. I think we've seen a little bit of that reaction by the central bank that's why they were easing, because non-tradable goods inflation was doing well. And of course, if you had disinflation or deflation in commodities prices, that feeds into non-tradable goods or services, things like that really are close to wages. So I don't see anything particularly alarming about what's going on with inflation. But non-tradable inflation did come down quite a bit, but it still wasn't really at a comfortable spot. So I was the monetary stance is tight, but I think I was a little bit, not surprised, but dismayed maybe with the cuts that they did do. It was just a little bit too early, because Brazil was growing fine at the time. There was really no...
The economy still seems fairly resilient too, at least in the private sector. It doesn't seem like economic activity is doing that poorly, which is one of the things I always try to explain to people that don't really understand Brazil. It's actually a pretty strong and diversified economy, especially relative to the rest of Latin America. I mean, it's been pretty robust.
No, exactly. And why is that? Well, you had a lot of people deleveraging, a lot of companies deleveraging. You have a lot of families that are still not very levered. And, whatever happened, in COVID, people were saving quite a bit of money because they were really worried about what was coming next. And like in all countries that gave an income transfer to help them through it, they didn't consume it. They kept it on hand. So and it's fiscal policy too. You have an expansionary fee. If you look at the composition of the recent growth, it's not an investment. It's in consumption. So it's not, unlike in Argentina, this is not a healthy consumption boom. I don't think there's any big problems of, MPLs or anything like that in the future, but it's driven by fiscal expansion, and that's a problem.
If you had to guess, is the deficit plan, the spending cut plan, going to be underwhelming? You think it's going to disappoint?
Yeah, I don't see the political pressure on this government and what they promise people is such that they're going to try to finesse it, just like the bringing back the pedaladas. They're issuing precatorios, which are the judgment debt. These guys go into court, they get a judgment, they issue that, and they do that, and we're starting to see it in other places as well. Other ways.
Everybody in 2022, everybody was selling it, and everybody had precartoria to sell. And I'd look at who buys this? You got to be crazy.
Banks finance it, right?
Some people might have made money, but it's basically overdue government debt, right? It's debt that should have been paid. And
well, it's not necessarily, it should have been paid because they got a judicial judgment.
Yeah.
So they have a claim on the U.S. government or the Brazilian government because they got a judgment in their favor. Most of it's Social Security judgments. And then you have a lot of Social Security debt outstanding. A lot of the companies owe Social Security debt. So that was starting to get cleaned up. It's not so anymore. And the other way that the government has financed itself to try to look at, that doesn't come in through primary spending, a couple to four savings funds. So they're sort of invading, a couple of the funds, not like I like FGTS, but not FGTS. There's a couple other funds that were created in the 60s that are still forced savings. You have to do it, and they're there, and they're trying to push it doesn't look really constitutional, but they are starting to borrow from those funds, and it doesn't appear as primary spending. So yes, Marcos Mendes, if he goes through the details of this, I went through it once, but you can see it in the numbers. It shows up in the numbers. Gross debt is growing rather quickly. Net debt is still growing, and the deficits are large, even if you're not counting these as primary spending. So
it's an unsustainable path, essentially, right?
Yes,
it can't go on like this.
No.
It can, but it will get significantly worse if it does.
Well, you get inflation. Right. You won't have a default. Yeah, inflation is the default.
You get a currency deval, and then
Yeah, and that's had a very bad experience with trying to default on their internal debt, even though it was going down as a percent of GDP because of inflation back with the Collor plan. It didn't work at all. It created a massive recession. So Brazil's way of defaulting is by this sort of secret one, and it's inflation. And so that's why, the fiscal side really, if they do adjustment like in Argentina, that gives the central bank a lot more leeway to try to combat inflation. In Argentina, they've done this massive fiscal adjustment. The central bank doesn't have the pressure from the treasury to monetize debt. They don't, to keep the interest rates where they are. They don't have to come in and buy a whole bunch of securities like they used to.
Yeah.
In Brazil, that's not the case. If you bring the the interest rate, if they want to control the interest rate lower, they're going to have to end up buying a lot of debt in the market, and that is done by money. So reserves in the banking system.
Yeah, one of the things that's so much to comparing Brazil to the U.S. is that people don't forget high inflation, that it is a tax, right? That implicit default. And Brazilians know. I mean, Brazilians are very, very culturally sensitive to inflation, even, 30 years after, 35 years after the Collor Plan. And it's interesting to watch Americans kind of go through that over the last 2 years where, inflation in 2020, no one talked about inflation in the United States. None of it. If I tried to explain inflation to an American friend, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't care, right? Like I can't feel it, right? I'm a frog in boiling
generational,
water.
Right?
Yeah, but now it's a top 3 election issue in the U.S., which is incredible how fast it comes. But Brazilians are wise to it. So I don't know what that implies, but if they're going to try and inflate it and pay for the deficit spending that way, I don't know. It would imply some type of a cultural shift or something has to change, right?
Well, we'll start to see other things move. We've already started to see the reserves, foreign exchange reserves to total public debt moving. They're basically equal now, whereas there was a premium. We're also seeing it was roughly 2 times, foreign exchange was roughly 2 times the public sector debt. That started to creep down. It's still a very comfortable position. What we're seeing, current account deficits that are very big. That's where it shows up as well. Import growth is very robust. So all these things will lead at some point, to either looser monetary policy or tighter monetary policy in a recession, and both usually lead to recession either way. I don't think inflationary is not expansionary. It's on the contrary. Why is that? Because it hits working capital costs. When you look at real interest rates on working capital in Brazil and inflation goes up, those go to the moon.
Yep.
And so companies can't operate. The working capital.
If you got to finance working capital at 15%, it's brutal.
Yeah, it used to be a lot more. When I did my dissertation, I calculated the discount on duplicatas, right? Discount on accounts receivable, a real rate of 500% a year. Part of it came back. Yeah.
You're running on a brutal hamster wheel. Why start a business if that's what you're going to do to maybe make 2 or 3% net at the end of the year? It's a hell of a lot of stress and work.
You have to net out the implicit values. Back then, you didn't have explicit fees for doing payroll or because there are discounts of accounts receivable, they had to collect. So and then they also had default risk.
They still
do. The banks
took
a lot on, but they still do. It's way much lower.
Yeah, but the factored receivable is still a pretty robust market in Brazil.
That's pretty much everywhere, right? That's the traditional way of financing working capital. And then you have working capital loans, and now they had a little different interest rate back in the day when things were still segmented, but it's still a good hefty interest rate. But that's where you're going to see it, and that will at the same time you're getting inflation, you're going to get a recession, unfortunately. And in Brazil, if I went back and looked at like the Conjuntura Econômica back in 1963, 1962, I went all back. And Mario Simonson, the very famous Brazilian economist, was writing then. As the inflation rate accelerated under Goulart, he said they wrote that they were going to get a recession. And that's exactly what happened. Empirically, inflation does not cause growth in Brazil. It's the other way around.
No, it's stagflation, right? Comes at the same time, right? You get the inflation and the economy takes a dip at the same time.
Yeah.
So what's the logic then behind the currency swaps then? So is that just trying to fend off inflation? Why spend some of those reserves going long BRL versus the dollar, which is essentially what they're doing, right? What's the point of defending? Like, can you explain the mechanism too? Because
when you buy a swap, usually you do it to hedge a dollar liability. So the main demand for swaps, unlike the sort of common wisdom about it, when you have big dollar inflows, the demands for swaps go up. Why? Because a lot of the dollar inflows, people are taking on dollar debt. They convert it to reais. And they have to hedge it, so they hedge it with swaps. So when dollars are floating out, the worst thing, people are unwinding their swaps. So they're not a substitute for dollars; they're a complement to dollars, right? So when we saw the big runs, people, the central bank tried to control it by issuing more swaps, and that's the exact opposite thing you wanted. No one wants swaps,
right? Because they did it at about 5, right when the real started breaking out a few months ago. Yeah. They tried to defend it. They issued the first swaps since Lula was president, so the first in a couple years.
No, I wouldn't read it that way because certainly Roberto Campos Neto understands this, and the desk understood this. The only people that didn't seem to understand, the only person that didn't seem to understand it was President Dilma and new analysts that come into the market that haven't really looked at it closely. But usually a hedging reason behind that.
But so it's
maybe,
not.
yeah.
So don't read it as defending the exchange rate.
Yeah.
It's a hedging of import inflows versus dollar denominated debt.
Exactly. Because think about the dynamic. If you issue a swap, that'll put downward pressure on local dollar interest rates, which will cause the exchange rate to depreciate, not appreciate. It does the exact opposite.
Right. Because if you look at the exchange rates, if they're defending it, which is a common rationalization,
narrative.
The reason I see, common narrative. That's the word I wanted. But then, 2 months later, currencies move 10% to devalue, and you go, okay, well, that didn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't work. I've been discussing this. I've written little teeny papers over and over, and we get a new generation of people in the market. I republish it because they're still saying they're the same as dollars. But a guy that really did a great academic was Marcio Garcia, where he shows, yes, the announcement effect is there, because what would happen is if you have an intervention with swaps, you would have an intervention in foreign exchange. So probably, I think they had been selling dollars as well. So when you sell dollars, that puts upward pressure on dollar interest rates. And selling a swap, it pushes them back down again. So the swaps are used to sterilize the foreign exchange intervention when they sell dollars into the market.
Okay.
Yes, the desk knows that. I had long discussions with the...
Are they that impactful? I mean, like in the grand scheme of things, do the swap contracts make a big difference?
I think they do. Yeah. Just because everything's arbitrage in Brazil. You have that doesn't mean that, they're arbitraged perfectly because you have you don't have perfect parity between the swaps and, the interest rates, but things happen very fast. There's risk premium there that sometimes are difficult to disentangle, but the central bank's foreign exchange desk understands this perfectly. So when you do your policy with an interest rate, you have to keep the interest rate constant.
Yep.
So if you're getting upward pressure on the interest rate, a way to do it without having to buy bonds is to issue swaps.
Push it back down.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. That makes a little more sense. So let's talk about the foreign flows then a little bit. I follow it from an equity perspective, but foreign investor flows into equities in Brazil have been negative all year. The domestic funds have all essentially dumped Brazilian assets and gone into, Brazilian depository receipts of American companies. So what do you think it's going to take to start to get the foreign investors interested in Brazil again? I mean,
that's a good question as well. I think you'll probably have to have a bit of a regime change. And as Brazil's always, I remember when Cardoso did Real Plan, he was interviewed right before I got interviewed, actually, on CNN-FN, and they asked him, was Brazil a new Asian tiger? And he said, what are you talking? He started laughing. He said, Brazil is a whale. It's not a tiger. It takes a long time. When it's going in the right direction, it takes a long time to get it going the wrong way.
Yeah,
we're not completely turned yet. All of this stuff is
like we talked about, the economy is still robust, right? Like it's
it took those governments that had this predilection for these types of policies. It took them 9 years. A lot of the armament that was there taken away. And then it took another 6 years to put it back, and now it's not going to be instantaneous. So this is undoable rather quickly. Yep. And it's because of now Brazil has an independent central bank, and it became really unindependent when Meirelles was made a cabinet member, and then Alexandre Tombini inherited that. He was a central bank president that was reporting to the president. When Meirelles went back in as the finance minister, he got rid of that. He had the central bank report to him, so he could give political cover to Ilan Goldfein. So that was a big difference there. That was a huge improvement in governance because, if you report to the president, you got to do what they say. And if you don't like what they say, you can resign, but then you have to think about the implications of resigning.
Yep.
So we've had a number of people that went in that basically fell on the sword. Joaquin Levy is one of them. In my view, a lot of people in the market are upset with Tombini, but I think he fell on the sword because of the possibility of something much worse going into the central bank. So, we have a good structure now. We have an independent central bank, and we've seen it resisted by Congress because that was the first thing that Lula tried to do. And the congressional leader said, no, we worked too hard to get this in place. We're not going to do that.
Give it back to you on day one.
Yeah. Exactly. So especially as there's a question about Galipo. His academic background is not one of monetary policy, or a rather strange version of it. And so we'll see. But so far, he's clearly very intelligent. He learns very quickly. The question is where is his heart of hearts? Is it where?
It's how political is he, right? Is he an economist that's going to try and figure it out economically, or is he there as a political appointee?
I don't know if I've ever met him. Probably
Yeah.
not. But I think the people at the central bank are trying to work in the best interest of Brazil. That's why, Roberto Campos Neto and his team were voted the best central bank in the world 3 times in a row.
Yeah,
They
well,
really were.
so
Yeah,
I think if you were to look at it from a foreign investor's perspective, right, Campos Neto leaving and a question mark coming in is more of a reason to wait and see and not come back in, right?
exactly.
Not
Exactly.
being pessimistic about it. Maybe it works out great, but why take the risk as a foreign investor with, 50 other countries you can invest in when you can just wait 6 months,
Yeah,
wait a year?
I think sometimes people look at multinationals. Usually, the multinationals that were able to make money over the years in Brazil kept a toehold. And we're so far away from that condition. Brazil is so
Yeah,
much
but
in better
kept
shape
a
than the
toehold.
90s,
What do you mean
than
by
the
kept a
80s.
toehold?
They kept themselves there.
Oh, in
The people
Brazil.
that left, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So you had a lot of people like Chrysler leave, in the 80s, okay? But you had Texas Instruments stay there. When things improved, all they do is sit there and depreciate their capital, function as well as they can, and wait. So you can't just liquidate your assets there and leave, right? You have things that there's no secondary market for and stuff like that. So you're better off
Yeah.
having some kind of cash flow.
Well, I don't think the situation's nearly dire enough that
No, exactly.
multinationals are thinking about closing down plants. It's not Argentina. It's not even close to what Argentina was 2 years ago.
No. Yeah, exactly. And it's not even close to what it was in the 1980s either. But
I mean, I still see companies investing too. My fiance works for an American company. They're going to hire 150 Brazilians over the next 12 months. So, there's
Brazil is
still
big, and there's sectors that are always going to do well. So in the aggregate, I've seen people go out of the stock market quite a bit, right? The foreign investors. But those investors can turn on a dime as long as they're comfortable.
It's fast money, right?
But the most important thing is that they have to be comfortable with the risks and the reward. So is Brazil's CDS where it's trading right now compensating you for possible problems over the next 5 years? Probably not. But if we look at the basic, exactly what CDS is pricing, will Brazil default on its foreign debt over the next 5 years? The probability is very close to zero. So you still get a good spread on it. So because they have their foreign exchange reserves, so it's hard to look at prices too. Exactly. People like to look at CDS, Brazil risk and spreads on bonds, but they're not always a good indicator. And then the local markets are not always that great an indicator also. But the best thing is to look at locals and see what they're doing.
Yeah, too, because I think, the headlines for Brazil, we're in the U.S. election cycle, but before that, with the Twitter shutdown and everything, Twitter, for better, for worse, whatever you think of it, it's the social media platform for financial markets, right? Every hedge fund manager, asset allocator, they're all there. So watching that play out with Twitter getting banned, right?
Yeah.
And then, there were American journalists too. It filtered into, because the day they had the huge protest on Paulista was the day after the NFL game in Sao Paulo. So all these American sports journalists that have nothing to do with financial markets or anything are going home and they're telling people, oh my God, they're actually censoring everybody. So I think the career risk, I think a lot of allocators are just going to put Brazil in, why would I want to be the person at my pension fund pitching this? Because if it goes bad, I'm going to look like an idiot because the signs were there. They closed down Twitter, for God's sake. Why would I want to take this career risk? Put it in the don't worry about it bucket and move on.
And this sort of taking over these forced savings funds too is sort of not a good signal because it's basically confiscation.
Well, I was about to say, the thing that scared the market the most, the feedback I got, wasn't they like, okay, they're in a fight with Twitter, it'll come back, but it's that they started seizing Starlink assets, which is a completely different cap table. And the impression people got was, okay, confiscation is back on the menu in Brazil, and it wasn't for years.
And also you're mixing apples with oranges too. The same thing they think about the foreign exchange was, I can just go there and take them. You can't do that. There's liabilities against those things. So I think we're already starting to see the pushback. It will never come in one fell swoop in Brazil. Brazil's Congress is very complicated. We will find out. We already found out in the regional elections last weekend.
Well,
and there was a pretty big movement. Yeah, PT was.
Were they the center of the movement at this point, or was Lula just the figurehead that they can get elected to get Bolsonaro out?
I think they thought he was probably more than that.
Yeah.
But I can't see a future of the PT without Lula.
No.
Again, I'm not a political scientist, but I think
he's old and he's not in good health. And
they've tried other candidates. I thought it's proved a little bit more nimble than I expected. Let me put it that way. But still.
But he was a failure. He was wildly unpopular as the mayor of Sao Paulo, right? I mean,
in certain, he wasn't a great mayor, and he wasn't a great presidential candidate as well. So who else do they have?
Lula's wife.
I can't think. There's so few governors left that are PTs. It's just really hard to think of somebody who could do it. So
yeah, I don't know. So then, what happens politically then? Like, if we do start to see a shift, what are you looking for?
No, it's already shifted to the right for sure, and the right is in quotation marks, because right and left in all these countries there's different definitions of them. I mean, we finally have the return of like a libertarian sort of grain in Brazilian politics, which hasn't existed since the 19th century. So, and it's already there, but not anything of sort of strong. Back in the 19th century, you had a pretty big libertarian type of thing. So
it seems like the far left is a little diminished too, right? It seems like the center kind of got squeezed into the middle more in Brazil.
Yeah.
Or no? I think the far left is still...
There's two different centers, right? Center in Congress, and there's a center of Brazil, the median voter. And my view, and I haven't seen anything, and a couple political scientists sort of bore out this opinion. This is an intuition I had years ago, and it's that the median voter center right in Brazil.
Yeah.
Okay. And the problem is, and it's not like a person. You can't, how you find the median is not their income. It's just a set of preferences. Yeah. So you have a survey, and Chris Gartman did a survey like this, and he basically showed my sort of intuition was more or less right, that if you take just by preferences, Brazilians are center right. Get rid of the political parties and all that kind of stuff. They want small and transparent government. They want a job. They want to be able to freely trade. They want to be able to freely move. And the question is, will the Brazilian political system cater to it? When they do, the politicians that do it succeed. That's what Cardoso did. Cardoso found the center. He made a coalition with the PFL, which is now the Democratas, which was the extreme right in Brazil, which is never that right, but it's a different kind of right than the United States. And he found the median voter. Lula in his first term was the median voter. And he put in fiscal austerity that was even more harsh than Cardoso did. And so we haven't, the middle is too crowded. That's the problem with the candidates. So you get the extremes getting the stuff. So you don't have, there's no candidate that's like these that can really coalesce to appeal to the median voter. So I don't see, maybe we'll see something. I don't know. So far, the dynamics, we get these new individuals. And that's the other problem in Brazil, is that the institutions are fairly strong. They've resisted this, but they're not that strong. It's still a little bit of cult of the individual, which is unfortunate. If it wasn't the cult of the individual, if the institutions were stronger, we wouldn't have so much anxiety, I think, about what's going to happen in the next election. But reality, even if you fake that you're doing one thing and you do another, everything you do has consequences. So the pedaladas came out, it was clear that there was going to be a fiscal problem, and it came pretty fast, relatively speaking. And the same kind of thing now. What they're doing, the poor policies they're doing, you're seeing already repercussions of them. That's my own opinion. I think they're poor. That's a value judgment on my part, but I don't think there's other things that, if for the objectives that everybody says they want to get, there's a lot better policies than the ones they're choosing.
So if you had to guess then, if we're looking 6 months out, where do you think Brazil is? Do they course correct a little bit? Is it full steam ahead on the path we talked about with the deficit spending?
No, I don't see that happening, because it'll be an off election year, and we have these elections in 2026. So whatever is done is going to be with an eye towards those elections. So I don't think the current administration thinks their ability to get reelected depends on fiscal austerity.
So you think they just keep the deficit spending, keep promising whatever they promised that got them there, and
keep doing things with executive.
To hell with the costs, and whatever happens, we'll figure it out after the next election.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, because
so then we're talking about higher inflation, Brazilian real against the dollar above 6, 7. We're talking about,
no, not that bad.
No,
I think
it's only 12, it's only a 12-15% move from here.
Yeah. And I think the dollar is high again. My model gives it below here. It was showing above 5 when we were below 4, and that was a big change for the model we talked about earlier this year. But I think the Brazilian democracy, as chaotic as it is, and all democracies are chaotic, has shown tensile strength to react, and we're seeing that already.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that you're seeing things done somewhat in a dictatorial type of way, it blows up in their face. And just like the first time with Lula, when he tries to use these sort of not very good ways to get stuff done to buy support, they blow up in his face. Yeah. And he's always either blows up with the PT or blows up with everybody else. The PT wants to monopolize power. So when they move to there, then the rest of the guys say, no, sorry, wait a second, And then if he goes that way, the PT, like we're seeing right now with this fiscal adjustment, we're seeing just big. I'm sorry, I cut you off, but that was
no. I was going to say, so more the same. So I guess when we talk back in a couple months and we chat again, I think we're going to be talking about deficit spending. Haddad's deficit cost cutting plan didn't work out, or wasn't enough.
I hope it's better than what I've seen so far.
Yeah,
it's sort of vaguish promises, nothing specific.
It feels like he's overpromised and he's going to underdeliver, which is the opposite of what he should have done, right? He should have underpromised and delivered more.
Yeah, and the fallback is more taxes, which that hasn't worked, then it won't work, right? So
then you just start to scare. I mean, you already did. I mean, how many wealthy Brazilians live in Orlando, right?
And the governors are starting to get not happy too. I mean,
because it affects their budgets, right? Like as
he sort of bought them by loosening the constraints on those budgets again, like he did with his second term and under Dilma, same thing. And then we had a fiscal problem in the States, and it took them 8 years to clean that up, and now they're sort of going back in the same direction. But that can only go so far. That can only go so far. And you have quite a few governors that have shown serious fiscal responsibility over the years, and they wouldn't go for that, especially when they've done all this fiscal adjustment. When the ones that don't do fiscal adjustment get bailed out,
the South and Southeast
Goiás,
Santa Catarina,
Espírito Santo, São Paulo, kind of,
it's a country in and of itself in a lot of ways.
Yeah, exactly. Rio Grande do Sul, no, they've sort of come back from being really bad, and Paraná, to a certain extent.
And then the problematic balance sheets are the Northeast and the North, right?
Well, you have a couple in the Northeast. Bahia isn't that bad.
Yeah.
And, you look at some of the, Piauí, not so bad.
No.
Yes, I don't think so. I'm trying to remember.
There's a shocking chart that goes around every once in a while. And it shows
go back and look at
it shows the map of Brazil, and it shows for every 100 reais a state sends to the federal government, how much they get back in benefits. And in Santa Catarina, Rio Grande do Sul, they send 100 and they get 10 reais back. So they're negative 90. Yeah. And then the negative 90, then you look in the Northeast and they get 250 back for every 100 they send. So essentially the South and the Southeast subsidize the North and Northeast in Brazil.
Yeah. And that's the Constitution of 1988 that created that.
Is that sustainable? I mean,
no, at some point you'd think they catch up. And that's one of the reasons their fiscal situation. Yeah. I mean, fiscal situation isn't that bad up the north. I mean, that's why the numbers aren't so bad in some of these states. I mean, Rio de Janeiro, forget it. Minas Gerais goes from being pretty good to really bad.
They're a weird one politically too, right? I don't understand Minas Gerais.
They used to be the center politically.
Because you've lived there, right? You have a house in Minas Gerais.
Yeah.
But they vote pretty far left for a governor, right? But then.
Well, it depends on who's carrying the vote. And people in Belo Horizonte consider the northeast of Minas Gerais part of the northeast of Brazil, right there on the border of Bahia. And as you come towards Espírito Santo, then it's a little less so. Rio de Janeiro is sort of up in the air, and then Juiz de Fora is there. And then you go other places, if you go west, it's a little much more conservative. So Thomas Skidmore, the very famous Brazilianist historian, I remember seeing him in 1990 at a conference at the Smithsonian. And he had he's very entertaining, and his books are excellent in terms of understanding Brazilian history. But he said, Brazil won't get better until they have a Mineiro, because the Minas Gerais is the median voter of Brazil in general.
That's kind of
it's a mini Brazil. Yeah, And then they got Itamar Franco. I don't think that's what they were thinking about, was Itamar Franco, but yes. And it used to be really, Minas has always been a very important state. It's less so than it used to be, but it used to be extremely important in the political scene. Tancredo Neves, right?
What book by Skidmore would you recommend?
Well, Brazil from Getúlio to Castelo is a great one.
Okay.
That's his dissertation. But then he has, his modern history of Latin America is really good. And he has Brazil. Yeah. He has an update to his dissertation that goes through Cardoso. I can't remember exactly that name.
Cool. I'll check it out. I hadn't heard of him.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, he passed away, but he's a very entertaining speaker and he's a brilliant guy. And there's a lot of his students running around and students of his students. So, and they're all quite good. Yeah. And Werner Bayer's books in terms of economics are very good. And L. Fischlow, if you want sort of compendiums sort of give you the whole sort of panorama, those are very good books.
How do you spell Baer? Werner
B-A-E-R. Yeah. He's got a lot of, I'm one of his students, and he's got a lot of graduate students. And L. Fischlow, although I wasn't a direct student, we got to know each other really well when I came back to New York. He was at Columbia. And he's got a lot of guys out of Berkeley, a lot of economists, Alexandre Schwartzman, Afonso Bevilacqua, Paulo Vieira da Cunha. All these guys were at Berkeley with him.
Perfect. I'm due for an Amazon drop, so I'll add him to the list. John, I've taken up too much of your time already. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll do it again. Obviously, in the future, we'll catch up because, like I said, Argentina and Brazil, we've covered well more than an hour. It gave us plenty to talk about. So
give a final word. When we talked back, was it March? Argentina was very a lot of risk. People were doubting whether anything could happen. And it basically happened the way I thought. It doesn't mean you can't buy something that's not good. It's just if you think it's going to improve and there's going to be and if you're being compensated for it, that's when you get in. So, actually the sell-off from Lula in his first term right away, things got so ridiculously cheap. I said, buy everything in sight because Lula thinks the market is just like the military. He's going to do everything to get the market on his side. We may get to a point like that in Brazil. It's not particularly expensive right now, though.
We did hit all-time highs, too, in local currency terms, right? The Bovespa is doing fine.
But it's very sensitive to the exchange rate. You still have a lot of commodities guys in there. So when the dollar goes up, it's a good hedge against the dollar. So, some things could change between now and the next time we talk. If they do, I'll let you know ahead of time. But I kept publishing the same things over and over again. And I sort of, I'll update this, but it's going to be minuscule. So I do think in Brazil, because the median voter is where it is, and ultimately the politicians that are successful cater to that middle, we'll get a change in Brazil. Just things have to play themselves out, I think, a bit.
On Brazilian time. Doesn't, like you said, it's a whale. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was Cardozo. That was a great analogy, I thought. So.
Yeah, it is for sure. So, all right, John, thanks so much. We'll talk again soon.
Yes, very good. Thank you, Patrick.
Be good.